The world speaks often of Iran today. You hear its name in a hum of distant headlines, in stories of conflict, of protest, of silence and resistance. It is a land at the crossroads of tension and tradition, watched closely but rarely understood. Yet long before its name was Iran, this land moved under a different name, Persia, and under that name, it casts a long shadow across time. Perhaps you've heard of Persia through the shimmer of storybooks, a place of silk tents and endless lanterns, of jeweled turbans and whispering carpets, a land where Scheherazade spun tales to hold off death, and where kings ruled with golden hands beneath perfumed canopies. 1,001 nights, each more dazzling than the last. But beyond the veil of myth was something quieter and far more real. Tonight, we return, not to Persia fantasy, but to the Persia that truly was, a place of breathtaking beauty and deep, enduring burdens, of golden courts and earthen homes, of poets and spies, of priests and stonemasons. Let us walk slowly now into the heart of that long-lost world. If you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so we have more motivation to produce better quality products. But now, the noise has died down and history is slowly unfolding gently. Chapter 1, Palace Gold Mud Brick Homes, Life at the Extremes. Begin not in the dust of a village, nor by the side of a field, but under the hush of towering stone. Picture it, the palace of Persepolis, where the walls do not merely rise, they declare, "Here." Stone lions freeze in motion at the base of columns tall enough to shame trees. In the hush of morning, the light gleams gold across sculpted wings and carved beards, and the centimeter still lingers faintly in the air. It was not a place one simply entered. One approached. One was made small by its symmetry. This was the world of the Achaemenid kings, Darius, Xerxes, and their kin, rulers not only of Persia, but of peoples and nations from the Nile to the Industry. To them, power was not just possessed, it was performed. Their palaces were instruments of theater, each step choreographed to remind visitor and servant alike that they stood beneath heaven's chosen. Inside, gold leaf shimmered on the walls. Thrones sat high on step platforms so that all eyes rose with reverence. Banquets stretched for hours with rare spices brought from distant shores, meats layered with fruits, and wine scented with rose and mint. The elite guests wore garments dyed in lapis and saffron, silks threaded with silver. Musicians played softly, not for pleasure, but for precision. Every note rehearsed, measured. The court was not only a place of luxury, it was a place of symbols. The king was rarely seen fully. Often, he sat behind veils or the far end of a columned hall, elevated, unapproachable. Even when he walked among his subjects, he moved with studied grace, surrounded by guards, scribes, and priests. His garments were carefully chosen. His silence, a kind of speech. Darius the Great, builder of cities and forger of order, understood the importance of image. In carvings and reliefs, he appeared serene, timeless, his hand lifted in blessing, his enemies crumbling beneath. No wrinkles, no blemish. Xerxes, his son, would follow this model with equal intensity, ensuring that even the stories told about him were edited for eternity. Yet the opulence was not without purpose. It was designed to show that the empire itself was orderly, eternal, and divine. Gold was not merely wealth. It was legitimacy. Ritual was not habit. It was proof. The court's rituals, from fire offerings to formal greetings, were embedded in the belief that chaos could be held back by elegance. The elite of the court believed themselves to be upholding more than governance. They maintained cosmic balance. The principle of Asha, truth, order, righteousness, was seen in every polished floor tile, every braid of the servant's robe. Even the food was symbolic. Sweet and sour, hot and cool, always balanced, always curated. But for all its beauty, the palace was a shell removed from the rhythms of daily life. The scent of the earth never touched its floors. The cries of the market were never heard in its courtyards. The king ruled over countless lives, but he did not walk among them. His slippers never touched mud. His ears rarely heard dissent. The entire palace whispered only what he wanted to hear. There is something serene in imagining it now. The hush of its corridors at dawn, the flicker of a single oil lamp in a carved alcove, the sound of soft sandals on polished stone, the gentle clink of golden bracelets, the silent glance of a eunuch steward bowing as he passed. No shouting, no haste, only ceremony. And yet, beneath the calm, there was anxiety. The weight of power is heavy, even when draped in silk. The king knew that uprisings stirred on the fringes, that some of the satraps were loyal only in appearance, that Egypt, that Babylon, that Bactria all watched, waited, and measured. So the court grew ever more performative. The illusion of strength became strength itself. Those who disagreed were silenced with grace. Those who served too well were sometimes watched more closely. Suspicion dressed in velvet. The king's word was law, but the law was layered. There were rules about who could approach, who could speak, who could wear which color in which room. Even how one knelt mattered. A sneeze at the wrong moment could mean exile. Every gesture was regulation. And regulation, in this place, was reverence. Women of the court, especially those of noble blood, navigated a labyrinth of expectation. Some wielded great influence behind silk screens, arranging marriages, smoothing rivalries, preserving lines of succession. Others, though cloaked in luxury, were little more than elegant ornaments, their silence mistaken for serenity, their movements rehearsed like music. Courtiers sharpened their skills not in battle, but in conversation. A phrase too forward could close doors for years. An anecdote well-timed could change one's fortunes. Even jest was dangerous, for laughter could hide critique, and critique was rarely forgiven. The walls had ears. The ears had memories. Still, life in the court was not all calculation. There were gardens, cool, geometric, fragrant with jasmine. Pools reflected stars at night. Poets recited verses in hushed tones by oil lamp. Children born into the palace knew nothing of want. Their toys were ivory, their tutors wise. For those within, the world seemed gentle, curated, composed. But outside, just beyond the view of the marble veranda, life moved differently. While nobles debated celestial omens, laborers hauled stone. While courtiers weighed metaphors, farmers counted raindrops. And yet, somehow, both lives belonged to the same empire. One gilded, one blistered, one designed for eternity, the other swept away with each generation. And today, as we gaze upon the silent pillars of Persepolis, we do not see power. We see its performance. We do not hear commands. We hear the echo of ritual. To be Persian royalty was not to live. It was to display. And as we leave the palace behind, we do not descend into history. We fall gently, from a world of mirrors and masks into the earthier truths that lay beneath it. Let us walk now toward the stonemasons. Now, far from the adored halls of Persepolis, let us lower our gaze. Past the guards, past the thresholds, out into the sun where the dust is not swept, but stirred by bare feet and worn sandals. Here, at the edges of empire, beneath the grandeur columns not yet raised, the laborers of Persia bent their backs to build what they would never enter. Imagine it. Men rising for the first light, not to the sound of a zither, but to the bark of an overseer, their breath forming ghosts in the morning chill, their fingers already stained with lime and dust. Some were paid, though not in coin. Others were indentured. Many were slaves. And though their names never appeared in inscriptions, their fingerprints remain pressed invisibly into stone. These builders came from across the empire. Elamites, Lydians, Babylonians, even captured Greeks. The empire's reach was wide, and so were the tongues spoken at a worksite. Orders shouted in one language, echoed in another. There were quarrels, songs, and moments of strange silence when all hands worked in rhythm. They were given rations, not salaries. Barley, beer, sometimes a measure of oil. Their homes were not homes, but quarters, low huts of mud brick, crumbling in the heat, patched in the cold. A family might share a single clay lamp. A mat on the floor served as bed, dining area, and prayer space. And yet they worked with astonishing skill. Stone blocks weighing tons were carved with precision, hoisted with wooden cranes, smoothed by hand over days, weeks. Artisans shaped double-headed eagles and lotus flowers into friezes. Others inscribed cuneiform messages dictated by distant scribes. Even a worker who could not read knew that each groove had meaning. There was pride in the craft. A foreman might boast of how finely his lintel aligned. A sculptor might whisper to his apprentice that their lion looked more alive than last season's. They had no control over design, but they mastered execution. They did not write the story, but they carved it. Breaks were short. Injuries were frequent. A chipped tooth from hauling stone. A crushed finger under timber. There were no doctors, just poultices of crushed herbs and the mutterings of old women who knew which leaf to chew for swelling. A man might limp for life because a wheel slipped. At night, they did not speak of empires. They spoke of meals, of aching backs, of a year's barley yield. A child's cough might dominate an evening. A neighbor's wedding might be the only joy in a season. They lived by the sun and slept by the moon, and neither paused for comfort. And yet, sometimes they laughed at the overseer's broken sandal, at the way a goat chewed on royal blue cloth. In those dusty camps, humor was rebellion. It reminded them they were more than hands. Women worked too, though rarely on the palace itself. They ground grain, hauled water, wove rough cloth. Some nursed children born of servants and slaves alike. Their tasks were endless but unnoticed. While men carved lions into stone, women carved endurance into generations. Few of them had names that survived. But on rare tablets discovered centuries later, we find lists, ration ledgers, recording 30 workers for media, or 12 women grinding wheat. Their existence acknowledged only through barley. Some workers believed they were building something sacred. They had heard of the king's divine favor, the holy fire he guarded. Others doubted. They had seen satraps drink too much, soldiers take too much, priests say too little. But belief was not required. Obedience was. They did not dream of being kings. They dreamed of rest, of a day without injury, of rain on time, of a full meal. Some may have carved their initials quietly behind a slab, a mark not of rebellion but of being. As decades passed, the palace grew. New crews arrived. Old men taught young boys with a stone cracked best. The tools changed slightly. The burdens did not. There was always another gate, another wing, another plaza. The king visited, rarely. When he did, everything was washed. Flags were raised. Wounds were hidden. Children were kept quiet. It was not a celebration. It was a pause and breath. One man, it is said, was caught sleeping near the royal approach path. He was punished, not for the act, but for the image. The palace was theater, and there was no room for fatigue in its script. Still, when the columns stood, when the carvings gleamed in new light, some laborers felt wonder, not pride, perhaps, but awe, that they had helped make something that would outlast them, that they, in the silence of the future, might still be felt through the cold skin of stone. And then they returned home, to patched roofs, to goats, to clay pots that cracked in winter, to mothers who asked for water, to wives who counted grain. Their lives did not make history, but they made history possible. And so we pause here, not in reverence, but in quiet attention, to the callous hands that made Persepolis rise, not to glorify suffering, but to acknowledge its shape, not to mourn their namelessness, but to remember that they once stood, hammer in hand, beneath the same sun that still touches those ruins. The palace dazzled, but the builders endured. Let us walk forward again. The next road is not lined with stone, but with dust. And in the dust, we will find the villages, the places left behind even by memory. Let us walk farther now, where the dust rises not from construction, but from wind passing over dry fields. The city is behind us, its gates carved and its courtyards measured. Before us lies another world, one not gilded or paved, but made of packed earth and habit. Here begins a contrast between Persian cities and the distant, slow-beating heart of its villages. In the grand cities of the empire, Susa, Ecbatana, Persepolis, the streets were laid with intention. Water channels carried the mountains melt into polished basins. Trees lined promenades, casting trembling shade on scholars, scribes, and visiting merchants. The air was laced with incense in the temples and spices in the markets. Time was measured by the sun, but also by the tolling of temple drums. and the pages of scrolls unroll by scribes who live by ink. But the village beyond those walls lived in another rhythm entirely. In a village, there was no silver scale to weigh goods, just the callous hand of the seller and the trust of the buyer. No water flowed in stone channels. Instead, families dug and maintained ancient cannons, underground channels that whisper with water when the gods were kind. A dry season could mean a season of hunger, and prayers rose not from formal temples, but from clay altars or from the quiet folding of hands toward a setting sun. In cities, men debated law and governance. In villages, justice was dispensed by the elder on a woven mat, his judgment shaped by memory more than code. Stories carried authority. A tale told twice was often taken as truth. Disputes were not resolved through citation, but through communal nodding. City priests wore robes with stitch symbols, their beards oiled and curled. They offered fire before gold statues, reciting hymns learned by rote. In the village, there might be no priest at all, only an old woman who remembered the words her mother whispered before lighting a fire. The divine was close and unpolished. In cities, markets thrived. Colored fabrics from Lydia, perfumes from India, lapis from far beyond the Zagros. But in the village, a market might mean 2 goats tied to a post and 3 pots of sour yogurt. Trade was local. Currency was sometimes barley. A favor today, a promise tomorrow. The divide was not only in economy, but in perception. To the urban elite, the village was a relic, necessary but backward. To the villager, the city was a rumor, distant, indulgent, sometimes dangerous. And yet, the two were not wholly separate. A son might leave the village for the city's schools. A city daughter, married into a provincial family, might carry with her a mirror or a scroll that became a village's only connection to empire. Ideas like seeds drifted. Architecture, too, told the tale. Cities boasted columns and reliefs. Villages offered low walls, sun-dried and often leaning. Roofs were not tiled, but thatched. Windows were few and narrow. The home was less for beauty than for shade and safety. Clothing differed as well. In cities, silks and patterned tunics shimmered in the light of audience halls. In the village, garments were homespun brown, beige, gray. A good cloak was passed down like a story. Children in cities learned letters. They recited names of kings. In villages, children learned when to plant, how to mend a fence, and what clouds meant what kind of rain. Wisdom was measured not in scrolls, but in seasons. But both city and village shared one thing: uncertainty. A satrap's tax might reach the furthest fields. A conscription order might sweep sons from both markets and sheepfolds. And disease, when it came, ignored all walls. During festivals, the gap narrowed. Villagers traveled for days to reach the cities. They saw fire temples, heard new instruments, marveled at jugglers and sacred dances. They returned with stories, half remembered, half imagined, and the city grew larger in the village mind. Likewise, when drought struck or bandits prowled, city dwellers remembered the villages. Grain came from those distant fields. Wool, oil, honey, all born in simplicity, consumed in opulence. The Persian Empire, vast as it was, held both its cities and villages in delicate balance. The king ruled from palaces, yes, but it was the village that fed the court. The court, in turn, sent edicts and coins, not always useful, often delayed. The thread connecting them was thin, but it held. In the end, the village endured. Cities were sacked, renamed, rebuilt, but the village, mud-walled, goat-filled, prayer-warmed, persisted. And it is perhaps here, in these forgotten corners, that Persia was most real, not in the carved stone of Persepolis, but in the cracked pots on a village shelf. Let us walk again, this time, into a realm divided not by soil or structure, but by who is seen and who is allowed to speak. For next, we consider the divides of gender and class, the invisible scaffolding of daily Persian life. In the Persian Empire, power did not reside in the city alone. It lived in fabrics, in gestures, in thresholds never crossed. Gender and class were not just categories, they were atmospheres. You could feel them in the way people walked, and who spoke first, and who never spoke at all. Among the nobility, Women held more power than often assumed. They managed estates, controlled servants, commissioned temples. Records from Persepolis mention women receiving rations for entire working teams. Some bore titles: overseers, landholders, heads of household. Yet their visibility was carefully staged. In public, they rode in covered litters, veiled, attended. Their presence was an absence, known but not seen. Court women, especially those related to the king, moved through marble corridors with the quiet authority of ritual. Their days were not idle. They supervised weaving workshops, religious offerings, and even agricultural ventures. A noble woman might not lead armies, but her signature on a grain requisition fed them. But this was one tier. Below it, in smaller towns and villages, women labored in ways more physical and less recorded. They woke before sunrise to grind grain, milk goats, prepare flatbread, sweep yards. A daughter might marry at 13, bear 5 children by 20, lose 3 by winter. Her name might never reach a tablet, but her rhythms shaped the household. Class stratified experience further. A court eunuch might wear silk, bathe in scented water, and deliver orders across provinces. Meanwhile, a free farmer might never leave his district. A slave might see the capital only from behind a wagon cart. The lines between gender and class often overlapped. A noble woman held more power than a male servant. A male peasant held more freedom than a female slave. Education played its part. Sons of the elite learned to write, to argue, to recite genealogies. Daughters might learn to read hymns or keep accounts. But outside of cities, literacy faded. Knowledge passed by firelight. From grandmother to child, from old man to apprentice. Religious roles also mirrored the divide. Male priests officiated in temples, reciting sacred words before fire. Some elite women maintained shrines within homes or family estates, offering daily devotions. But in the countryside, older women might act as midwives, healers, spiritual guides. Outside the sanctioned clergy, yet central to belief. And then there were the invisible, slaves taken in war, children sold in famine, foreigners with no patron. They moved in silence, belonged to no house, carried water, cleaned waste, aged quickly. Their class was defined by dependence. Their gender shaped how that burden fell. Court records spoke of justice, punishments of theft, disputes over cattle, contracts for marriage. But justice, too, followed rank. A noble's grievance traveled fast. A peasant might never leave his field. Women could inherit, but only under certain conditions. Slaves could earn freedom, but rarely did. Still, even within the margins, there were moments of joy. A festival in a village, a shared cup of wine, a child's birth, a neighbor's return from market. These small rituals defied rank. They reminded the poor that time still moved, that sweetness existed between seasons. Adornment, too, told stories. A noble woman's jewels gleamed in ceremony. A village girl's necklace, made from dyed thread and beads, held just as much meaning to her. Clothes marked status. But within their own world, each group dressed with care, with pride. The divide was not always cruel. It was structural, quiet, and persistent. The rich did not always intend harm. The poor did not always feel rage. But the lines held. One crossed them only through marriage, luck, or ambition. And even then, the past clung like dust. At night, in the capital, noble women might listen to musicians pluck melodies in shaded courtyards. In the hills, peasant women might hum lullabies to children curled on straw mats. Different worlds. The same moon, so we step gently now. Past robes and rags, past veils and sandals, past gold and clay. Not to compare suffering and luxury, but to understand their choreography. In Persia, status was a stage. Everyone had their mark, their motion, their silence. And so we leave chapter 1 with a question, not a conclusion. When an empire rises on hierarchy, what remains when its walls fall? Not just the ruins, but the echoes of who stood where, who spoke when, and who was never allowed to speak at all. Let us now enter the world of fire, of faith, of doctrine and doubt. The palace is dimmed, the workers have slept. A new dawn rises over temples. Chapter 2. Fire and Faith, Zoroastrian Order and its Shadows. Picture of fire, tall, constant, and nearly silent. Not the kind that devours or startles, but a flame that waits, watches, and warms. This fire is sacred, not because of what it destroys, but because of what it preserves. In ancient Persia, this steady flame did more than offer light. It defined a civilization. At the heart of Persian belief was Asha, a concept woven into everything. Asha was more than truth. It was cosmic alignment, the natural order, the harmony that held the stars in their spheres and crops in their rows. Opposing it was Diryuj, the force of falsehood and chaos. This dualism didn't merely suggest right and wrong. It demanded constant vigilance in thought, word, and deed. Zoroastrianism, the religious architecture that upheld this belief, shaped daily life and royal power alike. Its tenets were as rigorous as they were reassuring. The universe was a battleground of forces. Ahura Mazda, the wise lord, embodied all light and truth, while Ungramania represented decay, deceit, and suffering. Humanity's role was not passive. Every act could tip the scales. The sacred fire, always tended, never extinguished, burned in fire temples across the empire. These temples were stark. No idols, no grand statues, only fire and silence. Priests known as magi were its caretakers. They didn't preach, they didn't proselytize, they purified. Theirs was a religion of presence, of discipline, of ritual exactness. They recited prayers in the ancient Avestan tongue, circled fire altars with measured steps, and ensured not a speck of dirt entered the temple's sanctified grounds. Royalty embraced this cosmic order as justification for their rule. In inscriptions carved on mountains and palaces, kings declared their alignment with Asha. Darius the Great, for example, did not merely claim power through blood or conquest. He claimed it through righteousness. His success was a consequence of moral clarity, not military strength. It was this relationship between divine order and earthly governance that legitimized empire. But Asha wasn't confined to courts. It flowed through the streets, the homes, and the habits of ordinary people. Before planting a field, a farmer might whisper a prayer to ensure balance. A mother would light a lamp at night and teach her child that clean thoughts were as important as clean hands. A weaver might pause, thread halfway through loom, to correct a crooked pattern, because disorder, visible or unseen, invited decay. Zoroastrian purity laws were strict. Bodily cleanliness, moral speech, and food preparation were under constant scrutiny. One did not spit on fire. One did not relieve themselves near water. Illnesses were not just afflictions. They were signs that order had been broken somehow. To live rightly meant to live attentively. But there was comfort in these rules. A worldview in which every action mattered gave purpose to the smallest gesture. Saying truth, planting well, respecting light. It all meant something. Even death had a place in this order. When someone died, the body, considered temporarily unclean, was placed in a dogma or tower of silence, where vultures could carry it back to nature. Burial in the earth or cremation, both seen as polluting, were avoided. Nothing was wasted, nothing was misplaced. Heaven and hell, too, were reflections of one's choices, not eternal punishments arbitrarily imposed. Upon death, each soul crossed the Chinbat Bridge. If righteous, the bridge widened and the soul passed into light. If wicked, it narrowed and the soul fell. But this was no fire and brimstone judgment. It was a natural consequence of disharmony. Despite its spiritual clarity, Zoroastrianism was not egalitarian. Its rituals, though beautiful, often required time, space, and resources. The wealthy could afford priests and frequent purification. The poor had to improvise, burning kindling at home altars, reciting remembered hymns, doing what they could. Women, particularly, navigated a complex web of ritual purity. During menstruation or childbirth, they were temporarily excluded from sacred spaces, not out of malice, but because of doctrinal views on bodily transitions. Foreigners, too, stood outside this order. While Persian rulers were known for tolerating other faiths in their territories, within the inner circle of Zoroastrian practice, outsiders were treated with polite caution. Asha was not to be diluted. Even spoken words carried power. Truth was a force, and lies were not just incorrect, they were corrosive. Still, this was a religion of choice. Participation mattered. One did not plead for mercy. One proved worth through action. And so, an empire of farmers, scribes, builders, and kings lived each day as a small defense against chaos. They wore white as a sign of purity. They stepped carefully near water. They avoided swearing false oaths. And they prayed not for miracles, but for balance. Zoroastrianism, in its prime, didn't ask for cathedrals. It asked for clean hands and clean words. It didn't promise rapture. It promised that order could endure if people were attentive. So tonight, as we sit beside the memory of those quiet fires, let's consider what they meant. Not just flame in stone halls, but light carried in human lives. The idea that the universe, vast and uncertain, could be understood and even protected by how one spoke, how one washed, how one lived. Asha was not loud. It was steady. And in its steadiness, the world found its rhythm. Let us now step beyond the temple walls, where that same flame casts long shadows, where doctrine hardens into decree, and where belief is no longer invitation, but law. Imagine a world where silence is sacred, but also surveilled. In ancient Persia, the Zoroastrian priesthood did more than protect the flame. They guarded the very boundaries of acceptable thought. Religion was not merely a comfort or a compass. It was an instrument of rule, of control, of consolidation. The Magi, those same firekeepers once trusted to maintain cosmic balance, became watchmen of the word. Heresy was not an abstract danger. It was an existential threat to the harmony of Asha. To challenge orthodoxy was to unravel the fabric of order itself. And so, dissent did not flourish. It was watched, contained, and in many cases erased. Older polytheistic cults, those that whispered of sky gods and grain spirits, were slowly outlawed or absorbed. Their rituals faded not in protest, but in disuse. Sacred groves were cleared. Stones once marked for offerings stood bare. The old chants, passed mouth to mouth, were drowned out by official hymns. Foreign beliefs, too, were tolerated only from a distance. While Persia was outwardly pluralistic, allowing Jews to return from Babylon, permitting Greeks to speak their philosophies, it remained deeply protective of its core faith. Zoroastrian purity was not just spiritual, it was political. Religious texts were preserved, but tightly controlled. The Avesta, Zoroastrianism's sacred scripture, was recopied under supervision. Scribes worked slowly, ensuring no embellishment, no deviation. Even pronunciation mattered. A misplaced breath could alter meaning, could tilt truth toward falsehood. The priesthood aligned itself with the throne. Kings ruled not just with armies, but with a divine mandate, enforced by spiritual doctrine. To question the crown was to question Asha. To criticize a ruler's decree was to risk being labeled a voice of Dir Yujay, falsehood incarnate. The people, for their part, learned to step carefully. Public prayers were recited in correct sequence. Children were taught the danger of careless speech. Rumors, even when whispered behind walls, might travel further than intended. Punishment for religious deviation was rarely dramatic. More often, it was exclusion. A neighbor might stop visiting. A tradesman might be refused a right to open shop near a temple. A family could find themselves quietly pushed to the edge of communal life. Harmony required unity, and unity required silence. Fire temples became not only sanctuaries but checkpoints. Those who approached unclean, either in body or belief, were turned away. Priests inspected clothing, posture, the timbre of spoken prayers. Ritual became regulation. Purity became policy. The line between faith and fear blurred. And yet, this control was rarely cruel in appearance. There were no great inquisitions, no public executions. The power of Zoroastrian censorship lay in its subtlety. It worked like water against stone, slowly reshaping thought, dulling doubt, until compliance felt like peace. Still, resistance lingered. In kitchens, old songs were hummed beneath breath. In isolated villages, worn amulets bore half-erased inscriptions to forgotten gods. A traveling merchant might offer a blessing in a tongue the priest did not recognize. Belief could be bent, but not always broken. Thus, Persia became a land where religion protected order and quietly patrolled it, where faith offered light, but also cast deep shadows, and where silence was sometimes chosen, but just as often imposed. Let us now leave the silence of doctrine and step into the hum of daily life. There, among the clay hearts and flickering oil lamps, faith lives not in law, but in habit, not in edict, but in instinct, away from the echoing halls of fire temples. Beyond the polished sandals of priests and scribes lay a quieter religion, one less written and more whispered, one practiced in kitchens and courtyards, in the still spaces between sunrise and chores. This was the spiritual world of ordinary Persians, the farmers, the potters, the weavers, whose beliefs were not found in scrolls, but in rhythm, in ritual, in memory. Here, Zoroastrianism was not so much a doctrine to be debated as a habit to be kept. The fire still burned, yes, but in smaller forms. A flame maintained in a clay hearth was just as sacred to a grandmother in a dusty village as the roaring altars of the Magi. Prayers were said softly, often half-remembered, sometimes improvised. They were murmured while grinding grain, while preparing saffron tea, while washing the feet of a child before rest. This was a faith of gestures, a hand laid across the chest when walking past a fig tree, believed to be the resting place of a spirit. A pinch of ash touched to the forehead after cooking, a silver charm hidden in the fold of a child's garment, etched not with Zoroastrian scripture, but with older, stranger symbols inherited from forgotten deities. Folk Zoroastrianism, as we might call it now, was never uniform. Each region, each family, shaped it as they needed. In one village, a rooster might be seen as a sacred guardian. In another, it was the dog. Dreams carried meaning. Illness was seen not just as imbalance of body, but as an interruption of cosmic favor. Some women still tied knots in string and whispered to the moon. Some old men carried fragments of pre-Zoroastrian hymns, passed down not in writing, but in the sound of their father's voice. The priesthood knew of these practices, of course, and sometimes they scorned them, branding them as remnants of ignorance. But often, they tolerated them, quietly, reluctantly, so long as they did not contradict the larger order. The village fire was not as bright as the temples, but it was still fire. The boundary between sacred and superstitious blurred. Rituals blended. The chant of an Avesta verse might be followed by an old lullaby with the name of Anahita woven into its melody. Offerings made at official festivals, Nora's Merrigan, might be mirrored by private celebrations tied to harvests, births, and dreams. The common people did not speak of Asha and Dirje in philosophical terms, but they knew their meaning. Asha was a good harvest, the birth of a healthy child, the kindness of a neighbor. Dirje was drought, gossip, sickness, and well water. Balance was not a cosmic war, but daily walk across uneven ground. There were no libraries in most homes. Literacy was rare, especially outside cities. But wisdom lived in stories, in riddles, in proverbs. The fire forgets who lit it, but not who fed it, they said. Or, a straight path grows crooked when walked in pride. These sayings, shaped by Zoroastrian values, were more potent to a farmer than any distant decree. Children learned by watching, by mimicking. A boy learned to greet the dawn with a cup of water poured eastward. A girl learned that cleanliness was not just hygiene, but holiness. Hands were washed before touching food. Feet were rinsed before sleep. These acts, simple and quiet, were forms of worship. And always there was fear. Not loud fear, but the soft, constant hum of uncertainty. If a child fell ill, had the family failed in purity? If the goat died, had someone forgotten a prayer? If two neighbors quarreled, was it because the flame had gone too long without tending? In these questions, faith became more than comfort. It became a contract with the unseen. For some, the old god still lingered in shadow. The high god Ahura Mazda reigned, but beneath him, beneath the formal heavens, there were older spirits, half banished, never quite gone. A woman might still mutter the name of a water goddess before entering a stream. A man might wear a stone he believed protected him from demons that stalked dreams. These were not acts of rebellion. They were acts of continuity, of survival, of a people holding on to something older than empire. And so, while kings and priests shaped doctrine in capitals, in the mountains and deserts, people shaped their own truths. Not lies, but layers. Not heresy, but heritage. Let us pause here, at the door of a mud-walled home, where a father lights a wick in the name of light, and a mother folds bread with reverence. Let us listen, not to the chants of fire temples, but to lullabies and blessings sung not for power, but for peace. We turn now to a different kind of peace, and the tensions that lie within it. For Persia was not only Zoroastrian, it was diverse, rich in contradiction. Let us walk through the alleys of difference and examine the cohabitation of faiths, not always harmonious, but always intertwined. To understand the full reach of the Persian Empire is to recognize it not merely as a political entity, but as a spiritual crossroads. Though Zoroastrianism held a place of prominence, carried proudly by kings and priests alike, it was not the only voice speaking to the wind-swept streets of Susa or the bustling markets of Babylon. Persia, in its breadth and ambition, was a home to many gods, and to many who tried to live quietly beside them. The Jews of Babylon had carved out communities long before Cyrus the Great issued his famous decree, permitting them to return to Jerusalem. And many did return, but many remained, folding themselves into Persian society without ever losing their rituals or prayers. They worshiped behind closed doors, observed Sabbaths by lamplight, and studied sacred texts by memory more often than by scroll. Their survival was less a matter of favor than of quiet endurance. Meanwhile, in Western satrapies like Lydia or Cappadocia, the Greeks brought with them gods and thinkers. Altars to Apollo might stand not far from fire temples dedicated to Ahura Mazda. Some Persians were curious, drawn to the eloquence of rhetoric or the beauty of sculpture. Others were cautious, concerned that such ideas might sow the seeds of chaos, of doubt, of disorder. The duality that Zoroastrianism prized, truth and falsehood, light and dark, did not leave room for ambiguity. Even older traditions lingered in the eastern provinces. In Elam, mountain villages whispered prayers to forgotten deities, holding on to a pre-Zoroastrian past that had been slowly submerged under imperial ideology. Traders from the Indus Valley or beyond might bring talismans, chants, or stories that blended the sacred with the foreign. Persia tolerated many things, but tolerance is not always comfort. The kings liked to proclaim harmony. They carved in stone, they issued proclamations of peace, and they staged their courts with symbols of unity. Robes from Media, gold from Lydia, dancers from India. But unity was not uniformity, and beneath the surface, difference persisted. In markets, Jewish and Greek merchants might strike deals. In homes, meals might begin with prayers to Ahura Mazda or to a household idol. In villages, a child might grow up learning both the fire laws of Zoroaster and the stories of their ancestors' gods. Still, there were limits. Zoroastrian purity laws had implications that touched daily life. Who could prepare food, how the dead were buried, what festivals were observed. Burial customs, in particular, could mark someone as outside the accepted norm. Those who laid their dead to rest in ways not sanctioned by the Magi were often suspected, even ostracized. There was no empire-wide persecution, but there were soft pressures. A trader might find more success if he observed Zoroastrian rites. A village might be granted favor if it honored fire temples. Synagogues and shrines were allowed, but rarely celebrated. And in times of famine or revolt, it was often the outsider who was blamed. Yet despite the unease, there was also beauty in the mingling. Festivals could blend customs. A new year might be marked with both Zoroastrian rituals and local traditions. Children played before they learned to divide. Music drifted across belief systems. The empire's cultural richness owed much to these quiet, uncelebrated exchanges. And even within Zoroastrianism itself, variations grew. Some priests became stricter, calling for reform and purging of foreign elements. Others adapted, drawing upon older symbols to explain newer events. Religion in Persia was not a monolith, but a shifting tapestry, with sacred flames flickering against the winds of change. It is tempting to imagine ancient Persia as a land of order belief, where fire burned steadily and all hearts bowed to the same truth. But that was never quite the case. The empire held together not because everyone believed the same thing, but because they learned to live within the same walls, some with pride, others with patience. Let us now leave these alleyways of faith. Let us return to the wide roads and open skies, where trade flowed and letters flew. We move now from doctrine to distance, from prayer to passage. The empire opens, and with it, the road. Chapter 3. Empire roads, silk, spies, and soldiers. Close your eyes and imagine a ribbon of earth, pressed flat by centuries of travel, stretching across the land like a line drawn by an invisible hand. It does not wind like a river, but cuts cleanly across the empire, precise and purposeful. It is neither loud nor grand, not paved in stone nor lined with monuments, but hums with quiet power. This is the Royal Road, the artery of the Persian Empire. This road was not merely a means of transport. It was the pulse of an empire. It connected the beating heart of Persia and Susa to the distant reaches of Sardis, nearly 2,700 kilometers away. A courier could traverse its length in a week, but its construction had taken decades of vision and labor. It wasn't the first road built by man, but it was perhaps the first to so fully fuse political will with geographic reach. The road was first traced by Cyrus the Great, but it was under Darius that it took full form, measured, staffed, watched. Staging posts appeared like beads along a string, offering fresh horses shelter, food, and protection. This system turned the raw expanse of the empire into something legible, controllable. Chaos became order, and the road was its script. A message could begin at the palace gates in Susa and reach the ears of a satrap in the far west without delay. Gold, incense, military orders, even condolences, all rode on hoofbeats. But perhaps more important than goods were the watchers, spies, diplomats, officials. Eyes and ears of the king moved constantly along this thread of empire. The Persians had no need to shout to be heard. Their road whispered. You can imagine what the road looked like in a quiet morning. A wide dirt track in some places, a pressed stone path in others. It may have been flanked by tamarisks or completely exposed to the sun. There were places where the wind never stopped blowing, and others where shadows rested beside mud brick inns. Villagers learned to measure time by who passed on that road. There was always motion. A Greek merchant haggling over wool, a Bactrian caravan with bells tied to camels, an Elamite priestess cradling a scroll, soldiers, scribes, diplomats, performers, and thieves. The road did not discriminate. It received them all. Goods from across the known world move along it. Persian textiles, Indian spices, Babylonian glass, Anatolian silver, Central Asian furs. But it was not only silk or lapis that traveled here. Information moved just as swiftly. Rumors of revolt, of omens, of weather, of gods. The road was an artery, not just a material, but a thought. At regular intervals, royal relay stations waited. These were not grand palaces, but simple structures, a courtyard, a water well, stables. In the cooler hours of the night, fires flickered beside sleeping animals. Conversations floated in languages from across the empire. Deals were struck in low tones. Sometimes, oaths were made or broken under the stars. The couriers who used the road did not ride for profit. They rode for empire. Theirs was not a trade, but a duty. They were fast, disciplined, and protected by the law. No matter the terrain, snow, desert, river, they moved. And they were watched too, always watched. But this was not a road for everyone. The common villager might live beside it and never set foot upon it. For the peasant, it could be a source of fear, a path that brought tax collectors and soldiers. For the widow, a reminder of sons conscripted. For the rebel, a threat. The road brought order, yes, but also reach. No one was truly beyond the grasp of the great king. Yet despite that reach, the road was quiet. It did not thunder. Its dust rose gently. Even the chariots, when they came, passed like brief echoes of power. Its genius was in its invisibility, power that did not need to announce itself, because it was already everywhere. And so this road, though not gilded or monumental, was sacred in its own way. It allowed the vast and varied corners of the empire to breathe together. Cities that had never seen each other's walls were now linked by messages and trade. The sense of unity, the illusion or the truth, was carried by wheels and hooves. The royal road made it possible to be Persian, even if you had never seen Persepolis. Through the mountains of Media, the plains of Lydia, the salt deserts near Susa, and the riverbanks around Babylon, the road wound patiently. It avoided sacred groves and honored local customs. Some portions passed near burial mounds, others cut across farmlands, and every mile of it was watched, not by guards, but by time itself. It was used not only for commerce or communication, but for pilgrimage and poetry. Scholars took notes on its milestones. Poets imagined that gods traveled it by night. Even criminals, when fleeing justice, would sometimes follow its length, hoping to lose themselves in its traffic. Its fame would outlast its builders. Even as empires fell and cities burned, the bones of the royal road remained. Future conquerors, Alexander, the Romans, the Abbasids, would reuse its paths. Some modern highways still trace parts of its course. It did not end with Darius, nor did it vanish under boot of the Macedonians. It simply shifted forms, sometimes buried, sometimes paved over, sometimes broken by floods. But always, the land remembered where it ran. For the Persians, it was a way to map not just the earth, but the empire's soul. To walk it was to see Persia as more than a territory. It was to see it as an idea that flowed in both directions. Today, you could stand in a wheat field in central Iran or on a lonely hill in eastern Turkey and still be near its path. You wouldn't know it. No sign may mark the spot, but the birds would follow its wind. And perhaps, if you close your eyes, you could hear the hooves. A simple road, but never just a road. Let us continue, gently, toward the secrets it carried, the watchers in the shadows and the whispers behind each turning wheel. Close your eyes once more. Let the dust of the royal road settle behind you. Ahead lies something quieter, more deliberate. Not the pounding of hooves nor the bustle of caravans, but something softer, almost imperceptible. A long pause in conversation. A shadow that lingers a second too long. A face that watches and forgets to blink. In the Persian Empire, control did not always wear armor or carry a sword. Sometimes it carried nothing at all but a keen sense of where to look and when not to be seen. This was the hidden engine beneath the empire's golden mask. A machinery of perception, a network of watchers, listeners, and soft-stepping messengers who ensured that the king's authority reached not only into streets and temples, but into thoughts, glances, and dreams. While others celebrated the grandeur of Persepolis, the real strength of Persia often moved unnoticed through silence, suspicion, and the delicate art of observation. They call it the king's eye, and sometimes the king's ear. Titles less literal than symbolic. This was no single man. No robed elder perched atop a spire with a scroll. It was a presence, dispersed, unseen, and everywhere. An empire-wide nervous system, quietly gathering the pulses of markets, palaces, courts, and homes. It blinked only when it chose to. In a world with no telegraphs, no telephones, no satellites, Persia built a system of awareness that rivals even the most advanced modern bureaucracies. The secret was in its subtlety. It was never announced. It simply was. And that, perhaps, is what made it so effective. Let us step into one of the inns that lined the royal road. Simple clay walls, a central courtyard, a few mats rolled out beside the fire. Men chew dates and speak softly about the weight of their camel loads, the price of lapis, or the weather in Babylon. One pours wine with a smile that doesn't reach his eyes. Another listens while pretending not to. Neither may be a spy, but both might report what they hear. The Persian Empire trained some spies and used others without their knowledge. An innkeeper with a good memory could become a trusted ear. A merchant who traveled often might be asked to pass along news. Some did it for coin, others for favor. Many never knew they served the crown at all. Even priests, scribes, and traveling entertainers could play roles. The court jester might be more than a fool. The scribe recording taxes might remember who paid late. The traveling bard might recite a poem that carried hidden warnings instead of praises. In the palace, the king's inspectors held real power. These were men of learning, calm and hard to impress. They appeared without notice in provinces, attended trials, inspected granaries, spoke with villagers. They didn't shout. They observed. And they wrote. Quiet scrolls that traveled swiftly back to Susa. Their presence alone could unsettle a satrap. The satraps, governors of the vast Persian territories, were powerful but never free from scrutiny. No matter how distant their palaces, how loyal their soldiers, or how generous their temples, they knew someone was watching. That knowledge shaped their decisions more than any sword. Even the postal couriers, those proud riders of the royal road, carried more than sealed scrolls. Some bore verbal messages too sensitive to commit to ink. Some noticed troop movements. Some counted coins. Their value wasn't only in swiftness, but in the quiet wisdom of knowing what not to ask and what not to forget. And then there were the whispers. Rumors gathered like leaves in courtyards, each one swept up by someone, taken back to capital and sorted for its meaning. A merchant arrested in Sardis, a temple burning in Bactria, a chieftain refusing tribute near the Caspian Sea. These were not just events, they were signals. The empire read them all. To the average citizen, this surveillance may have been invisible, or it may have been deeply felt. A craftsman might lower his voice when criticizing the satrap's tax. A farmer might refuse to host strangers, fearing hidden ears. Paranoia, after all, was part of the design. But it was not fear alone that made the system work. It was precision. The king's eye did not waste time on every whisper. It knew which voices to ignore and which to follow. That selectivity was its brilliance and its menace. Punishment, when it came, was rarely public. A tax collector might be removed without explanation. A priest reassigned. A merchant disappeared between cities. The lesson was clear. The empire knew, and it did not forget. It was not only enemies who were watched. The friends of the court were too. Generals were observed for ambition, priests for popularity. Even relatives of the king were not exempt. Favor could become suspicion overnight. In this way, the Persian Empire preserved its cohesion. It avoided uprisings not by crushing them after they began, but by seeing them take shape in their earliest moments, when they were still ideas rather than armies. And so the vast empire, stretching from the Indus Valley to the shores of the Aegean, from the desert of Arabia to the mountains of Armenia, held together not merely by roads and gold, but by awareness, by soft steps in the dark, by watchers who never revealed themselves, and listeners who never spoke. Even in today's world, remnants of the system survive, not in form, but in instinct. Modern governments with vast reach still rely on the same balance of trust and observation. And the lesson of Persia remains. Surveillance need not shout. Sometimes, the quietest empire is the most enduring. If you stood on a moonlit hill overlooking a caravan in the heart of the empire, you might hear nothing but the sigh of wind. But within that wind, something listened, something remembered, and now, gently, we move forward towards soldiers in silk, generals in golden armor, and the fragile balance between rule and revolt. The watchers will follow, of course. They always do. Let us now shift our gaze slowly from the whisper exchanges of surveillance to the more visible, but no less disciplined, projection of Persian power. It's military, not simply its size or its victories, but its very nature, both refined and theatrical, disciplined and symbolic. In an empire so vast, it was not enough to be feared. One had to be seen. The Persian army at its best was an emblem of control, and at its worst, a mirror of the internal strains threatening the very unity it marched to protect. Begin with the immortals. Their name alone invites curiosity. 10,000 soldiers, always maintained at that precise number. When one fell or retired, another immediately replaced him. To the outsider, it created the illusion of an eternal force. They were the empire's elite, yes, but also its image, a living banner of order and eternity. Clad in ornate tunics, armed with spears and bows, they did not resemble the rugged warriors of the Greek phalanx or the tribal raiders of the steppes. They looked like soldiers from a dream, too perfect, too symmetrical. They marched not only to win, but to be watched, and in being watched, to send a message. But not all Persian soldiers were immortals. Most were drawn from the provinces, archers from Elam, cavalry from Bactria, spearmen from Media. The army was a mirror of the empire itself. diverse, multilingual, adorned in different armor styles. In times of celebration, this diversity was paraded. In times of rebellion, it became a risk, for not all corners of the empire were content. Egypt, so rich and so proud, had to be reconquered again and again. Babylon simmered with resentment. The fringes near Scythia and India often fell quiet, not from peace, but distance. The very geography that allowed Persia to gather tribute also made it difficult to enforce. And so, rebellions came, not many, but enough. A satrap who taxed too cruelly, a priest who claimed divine visions, a general whose loyalty grew thinner than his patience. And when revolt stirred, it was not crushed in haste. The empire moved with deliberation, precision, always with the intention of not only defeating, but discouraging. Take, for instance, the revolt in Egypt. Darius I reconquered the region not simply with troops, but with tolerance. Temples were restored, priests honored, local traditions respected. The sword came with a scroll, and often the scroll came first. Resistance was treated like a fire, contained, smothered, but never fully extinguished. And then there were the tax revolts, less dramatic than wars, but far more frequent. A city delayed payments, a province underreported harvests. Here, too, the Persian response was layered: investigate, negotiate, isolate, and only then punish. Soldiers were sent not just to fight, but to observe, to collect data. In this, Persia was ahead of its time. The military itself functioned not just as enforcers, but messengers. Their presence in the city square could alter behavior. Their absence could invite defiance. The empire learned to deploy power like a shadow, never all at once, never without purpose. But shadows can stretch thin. In Bactria, garrisons grew restless. In Lydia, soldiers became entwined in local politics. The further from Susa, the more autonomy crept in, not just for governors, but for troops. This decentralization, though inevitable, was dangerous. It required more watching, more messages, more delicate touch. Even within the army, class and culture clashed. The noble-born commander from Persepolis might not understand the dialect of his Median scouts. The tribute troops from the Caucasus might not share the religion of their Elamite brothers-in-arms. And yet, they marched together, bound not by love, but by necessity. There were moments when all this held together beautifully. Military parades in Persepolis that seemed to erase all difference, if only for a day. Victories where archers, horsemen, and engineers worked in fluid precision. Siege towers that rose overnight. Cavalry charges that broke enemy lines like waves. But these moments were fleeting. More often, the army was managing decay, not dramatic collapse, but erosion. Morale dipped, supplies failed, orders delayed. Small mutinies occurred, not out of ideology, but exhaustion. In the empire's final century, this grew worse. Not enough to end Persia, but enough to bruise it. And still, the immortals marched, polished, precise, beautiful. Still, the roads delivered orders. Still, the provinces paid tribute. But the strain beneath the silk deepened. The Persians mastered the art of military performance. But performance by nature is exhausting. To hold up the image of eternal strength while stitching together rebellion, famine, and fatigue, it took more than armies. It took endurance. And so the Persian military remained an empire within the empire, loyal, proud, and increasingly fragile. A mirror of Persia itself, gilded, vast, noble, and pulled in too many directions. Now, gently, we move from armies to trade once more, from conflict to commerce. For not all power is maintained by force. Some is sustained by silk, by scent, by promises whispered between cities. Let's follow those soft trails next. When we think of ancient Persia, it's easy to picture armored warriors and golden palaces. But in truth, some of the most enduring power flowed quietly, carried not on the tips of spears, but on the backs of camels and within the folds of fabric. The Silk Road, more than a road, was a network of lifelines. It wound from China through Persia, crossing deserts and mountains, ferrying not just goods but ideas, ambitions, and inequalities. Imagine the soft rustle of silk, dyed deep indigo or glowing crimson. passing hand to hand in the stalls of Susa. Lapis lazuli from Bactria sparkled beneath the sun. Spices, clove, saffron, cinnamon, floated on the air. And gold, always gold, threaded through every transaction. For the Persian elite, trade was not just profit. It was proof of control, of taste, of divine order. Merchants who mastered the roads, who secured the right contacts and offered the right tributes, could ascend. Some became almost aristocratic. Their children wore imported linens. Their homes echoed with foreign instruments. Their language peppered with words from far-off lands. These were the winners, the traders who moved easily through the empire's arteries. But this success was narrow. For every merchant who rose, there were hundreds who labored. Craftsmen who wove fine textiles never wore them. Tanners who prepared the leather for saddlebags never left their villages. Women who spun silk or embroidered patterns worked by lamplight, eyes strained, hands rough. The trade routes brought wealth, yes, but also division. The further a person lived from the main arteries, those carefully patrolled royal roads, the less they shared in the bounty. Villagers who watched caravans pass had little say in where the goods ended up. They were witnesses to luxury, not recipients. And then there were the nomads. The empire's borders touched the lands of Scythians, the Arabs, the desert tribes. They were often taxed, sometimes tolerated, occasionally crushed. Their knowledge of terrain was unmatched, their mobility a threat, and their role in trade essential. Yet they remained outsiders, transporters of goods they could rarely afford. Even within the cities, inequality lingered. A merchant in Persepolis might deal directly with royal agents. Another, in a lesser town, might face constant suspicion. Guild protected some trades, but many craftsmen worked outside them. There was beauty in the bazaars, but also competition, exploitation, and stratification. Some regions specialized. Elam provided bricks and textiles. Media offered horses. The port cities near the Gulf became gateways for pearls and incense. But this specialization bred dependence. A poor harvest in one zone could ripple through the trade network, causing famine, inflation, unrest. Religion, too, played a part. Certain priesthoods controlled temple warehouses, storing grain, wool, incense. These institutions could loan materials or deny access. And in a culture where purity and ritual shaped even mundane exchanges, this control became yet another axis of power. Occasionally, traders from beyond the empire appeared. Chinese envoys, Indian sailors, Arab camel-train leaders. They were welcomed with caution. Their goods were valued, but their presence monitored. Trade brought opportunity, but also risk. The risk of foreign ideas, foreign gods, foreign loyalties. What did the Persian state offer in return? Roads, wide, paved, guarded, in spaced at careful intervals. Patrols to ensure security. Coins minted in silver and gold, stamped with royal faces and divine symbols. Stability, or the illusion of it, enough to keep the goods flowing. But stability favored the few. A trader with a royal license passed quickly. One without it faced delays, bribes, and danger. In this way, commerce became stratified. Success was not just about what you sold, but who you knew, what you could offer, what you were allowed. Stories passed along the trade routes, too. Tales of strange customs, magical beasts, cities of glass. These were not just fantasies. They were currency. A merchant who could entertain or inform might be granted a better deal, a warmer welcome. Words, like spices, were traded with care. And still, the silk moved, through storms and bandits, over mountain passes, across empty plains. It shimmered in royal courts and glowed in the lamplight of smaller homes, only briefly, before being sold again. Its journey never truly ended. In the end, the Silk Road revealed the empire's paradox, a network of openness, built atop deep inequality, a channel of beauty, paid for in calloused hands, a system where luxury moved easily, but people did not. Even as Persia grew weary, battling rebellion, facing foreign enemies, the trade endured, because desire endured, for color, for flavor, for softness, for difference. Trade was not Persia's heart, but it was its pulse. Steady, uneven, vital. And so, with quiet footsteps, we leave the roads now. We turn toward something colder, more calculated. The workings of court, where ambition replaced maps, where politics became poison, where the next fall of Persia began not in battle, but in a whisper behind a curtain. Chapter 4, Politics, Poison, and the Fall of Grandeur. Imagine now, if you will, a room not unlike the inner sanctum of a palace, silent, veiled, and thick with the scent of sandalwood. The light from oil lamps dances off polished stone, and tapestries muffle the sound of footsteps. Here, decisions are made not with fanfare, but with glances. Alliances forged over wine. Destinies unraveled with a single whisper. Such was the heart of Persian imperial politics in its later days. Not the battlefield, not the border fort, but the court. And within the court, power was not stable. It was fluid, a shifting, glittering stream of favors, loyalties, and betrayals. No sword was ever truly sheathed. No word ever forgotten. In the Achaemenid court, succession was less a ritual than a gamble. The king's sons, sometimes dozens, vied for position, their mothers maneuvering behind silk curtains, their tutors whispering strategies. Brothers plotted against one another, sometimes encouraged by ministers who hedged their bets by offering fealty to more than one prince. The result? Not unity, but tension, palpable, quiet, ever-present. Some courtiers thrived in this atmosphere, viziers with silver tongues, eunuchs who knew every corridor and every secret, generals who served not armies but ambitions. They wore calm faces, but beneath their robes were sharp instincts. They understood that favor was fleeting, that to rise, one must eliminate rivals, gently if possible, discreetly always, and so came the poison, not always literal, though that, too, had its place, but more often poison of another kind, rumors, forged letters, delayed messages. A nobleman's failure blamed on fabricated treason. A queen's son sent to a far-off post. Too far to be a threat, but not far enough to raise suspicion. These were games of shadows, not swords, and those who played them learned to speak with care, to bow with the correct angle, to smile when they wanted to scream. It was a court of masks, each more convincing than the last. Yet even masks slipped, and when they did, punishment was swift. Disgraced nobles exiled, royal kin quietly removed. A single night might see a dozen arrests. No public spectacle, just silence where once there had been laughter. In such a court, trust was rare. Even servants spied. Messages passed between wine bearers. Guards swore loyalty. But to which prince, which vizier? No one truly knew. Power was not about strength, but proximity to the throne, to the ear of the king, or, if one was bold enough, to the one who might soon replace him. This atmosphere fostered brilliance and paranoia. Great architectural plans emerged from royal commissions, but so did assassinations veiled as hunting accidents. An empire capable of binding distant lands together could not always keep its own palace whole. The palace itself mirrored this contradiction. Imposing from the outside, labyrinthine within, visitors marvel at the carved columns, the lotus capitals, the reliefs of tribute bearers from every province. But beyond those grand halls were the quieter rooms, smaller, shaded, secretive. These were the true heart of the court, not the throne room, but the antechamber, not the banquet, but the private supper. The weight of empire rested not just on armies, but on whispers, on who dined where, on whose messenger rode out at dawn, on which scroll was opened first. And yet, for all this tension, there was beauty, the artistry of court musicians, the calligraphy of royal scribes, the elegance of court dress, layered and dyed with indigo, saffron, and rose. These were not just distractions, they were tools. A well-timed song could sway a mood. A carefully chosen garment could signal allegiance or dissent. Queens, too, wielded quiet power. Some controlled estates. Others influenced succession. Their presence in court was carefully choreographed, appearing at ceremonies, vanishing during intrigue. But they were never truly absent. Their chambers were command posts. their friendships, political assets. It was an empire within an empire, a realm where the coin was not gold, but attention, where one's fortune rose not with battle, but with banquet seating. But this system, elegant as it was, frayed. As central authority weakened, satraps grew bold. As the king aged, favorites multiplied. As outside threats mounted, internal cohesion crumbled. The games became more desperate, the stakes higher, princes more ruthless. And as Persia turned its gaze outward, to Greece, to Egypt, to the steppes, it forgot to look inward, to see the rot not beneath its temples, but behind its doors. In time, the empire would fall not with bang, but with silence, with messenger who arrived too late, with a general who hesitated, with a vizier who backed the wrong heir. The court, for all its splendor, had become a palace of sand. And so, as we drift forward, let us leave the corridors behind, step into the open air, where governors built their own courts, where loyalty fractured, where Persia was no longer one, but many, held together by habit, not by heart. In the next chapter, we walk among satraps and shadows, rulers who ruled in name, but not in spirit. The map still bore the king's name, but the lands they had begun to forget. Begin with the map, not a modern one, but a painted hide spread across a royal table, heavy with the scent of smoke and ink. On it, names bloom in red and black: Aria, Lydia, Bactria, Egypt, provinces and satrapies, each ruled not by the king himself, but by satraps, governors with great autonomy, charged with collecting taxes, maintaining armies, and keeping the peace. But as the court weakened, these men began to believe the map belonged to them. Satraps were appointed by the king, but they were not always loyal to him. Their posts were often hereditary, their palaces built like miniature Persepolises, their courts echoing the same rhythms of ritual and flattery found in the heart of the empire. Over time, many came to rule less like administrators and more like kings in waiting. Some grew bold, issuing their own coins, leading their own campaigns, forging alliances independent of the throne. In Lydia, governors collected tribute yet withheld it. In Egypt, taxes paid for local wars. In the east, Bactrian satraps aligned with nomadic rulers, trading influence for protection. They were still Persian, yes, but Persian on their own terms. Their banners bore the king's name, but their ambitions bore their own. As communication across vast distances became harder, and as the central treasury strained under the cost of wars and extravagance, satraps filled the vacuum. They built canals, hired architects, established courts of justice that bore only superficial resemblance to the royal model. And their people, seeing more law and order under the satrap than from distant Susa, began to transfer their loyalty accordingly. This decentralization was not rebellion, at least not yet. It was survival, but it sowed seeds of fragmentation that would blossom in time. In truth, the Achaemenid model had always carried the seeds of its own undoing. Its strength lay in tolerance, in delegation. But these virtues also meant distance. A governor in Sardis could serve a king he'd never seen. A satrap in Aria might never send his son to the royal court. Loyalty was assumed but rarely tested. And when it was tested, when the court demanded more taxes, more soldiers, more deference, it found only delay, excuses, silence. Power had slipped through the gaps. Persia's borders still held, but its inner threads were fraying. This weakening cohesion allowed local cultures to reassert themselves. In some regions, old dialects reemerged. Temples once suppressed now thrived. Persian customs were maintained for ceremony, but local traditions ruled daily life. Even within satrapies, new factions formed. Noble houses within provinces began to jostle for control, creating conflicts the central empire could neither predict nor quell. And then there were the mercenaries, hired by satraps to maintain order. They brought with them foreign tongues, foreign loyalties. Greeks, Scythians, Arabs, all fought not for Persia, but for coin. Their presence was a symptom. An empire once proud of its immortals now hired strangers to defend its gates. When the king issued decrees, they were respected, until they weren't. When scrolls of law arrived, some were read, others discarded. The court was not forgotten. It was simply ignored. And so the empire became a mosaic. Each satrapy a tile, still beautiful, still part of the whole, but no longer fused. This was not collapse. Not yet, but it was drift, a slow, almost imperceptible erosion of unity. The kind of shift you don't feel until it's too late to stop. Behind this erosion also lay personal ambition. The sons of satraps raised in semi-independent courts did not dream of serving a distant emperor. They dreamt of eclipsing him. These heirs were educated, adorned in silks, surrounded by tutors and mercenaries, trained more as rulers and stewards. And in this ambition, they began to fund rival centers of power. Temples rededicated to local deities, archives filled with regional law, coins bearing their father's face rather than the king's. Even art began to fragment. Reliefs that once depicted unified imperial iconography started showing local myths, regional victories, and heroes unknown in the royal canon. Persia's cultural identity, once anchored by Persepolis, became diluted, kaleidoscopic, still Persian, but increasingly unrecognizable. The fracturing was slow, silent, but unmistakable. Delegations no longer addressed the king first, but the satrap. Foreign envoys negotiated terms of provincial palaces before ever seeking audience with the imperial court. In places like Sardis, Memphis, and Ecbatana, the king became more a myth than a monarch. Satrapal courts mirrored the capital, but mirrored with distortion. Where the king's court relied on ancient ceremony, the satrap's court bent to pragmatism. Where the king was served by eunuchs bred for loyalty, satraps relied on bloodlines, ambition, and bribes. And where the king spoke in proclamations, satraps ruled through whispers. In time, the idea of empire began to shift, from a unified body to a patchwork of powerful regions loosely tethered to a fading center. From a roaring lion to many voices murmuring in the dark, the sons of satraps married daughters of neighboring lords. Alliances formed that cared less for empire and more for territory. Borders once defined by the crown were redrawn in negotiations between cousins and rivals. Festivals once dedicated to imperial triumph now honored local legends. Songs once sung in Old Persian now carried the cadence of mountain dialects. And the king's name, once invoked with reverence, was spoken as memory, not presence. Even in the capital, whispers of discontent rose. Courtiers questioned the loyalty of governors. The treasury grew nervous as gold trickled in slowly, if at all. The scribes who once copied royal decrees now hesitated. What good were orders no one obeyed? This wasn't a rebellion. It was a forgetting, a fading, not in fire or sword, but in apathy. The empire still stood, but hollowed. And so, as we leave this chapter, picture not war drums or toppled thrones, but fading ink, letters never answered, commands rewritten, satraps no longer waiting for permission, but simply acting. Persia, at its most golden, was no longer one. It was many, and in that manyness, the unraveling had already begun. Now, let's turn toward how others saw this unraveling, how foreign eyes measured Persia's splendor and its cracks, and how in one corner of the Aegean, firelight caught on a warrior's blade, and the Greco-Persian conflict began to simmer. Do not begin with the clash of bronze or the rhythm of marching feet. Instead, begin in the soft murmur of rumor, carried over the sea by merchants, philosophers, and seafarers. Begin with the whispers that crossed the Aegean from the shores of Ionia, that spoke of a place across the desert, across the Zagros, where kings lived in palaces heavy with gold and halls echoed with the footsteps of servants. A place where rulers claimed the favor of the gods and expected the obedience of men. To the Greeks, it was Persia, and it was both mesmerizing and monstrous. This perception was not born of war, but of contrast, where Greek city-states prized discourse and debate, however fragile. Persia radiated authority, where Athens celebrated messy assemblies. Persia enforced the polished silence of imperial edicts. This dichotomy seeded both fascination and fear. Trade brought the two worlds closer. Persian goods, silks, spices, lapis lazuli, were coveted in Greek markets. But trade was never neutral. Each exchange carried more than merchandise. It carried the scent of hierarchy, of imperial patronage, a world order from the top down. Greek merchants rubbed shoulders with Persian satraps. Influence followed, sometimes quiet, sometimes not. And then there were the exiles. Greek leaders, ousted in internal strife, found sanctuary at Persian courts. They brought with them news, grievances, and ambitions. Persia gave them coin and purpose. Greece, in turn, saw these acts not as mercy but as meddling. Loyalty in the ancient world was often least. Tension simmered in the Ionian cities, Greek colonies under Persian rule. Their identities were complex. Culturally Greek, politically Persian, caught in the gray. They paid taxes to the empire, but prayed to Greek gods. They followed Persian laws, but read Homeric verse. It was a fragile arrangement. In 499 BC, it fractured. The Ionian revolt began. It was not a carefully orchestrated rebellion, but a chaotic cry for autonomy. Discontent bubbled over. The spark came from Miletus, but the fire spread to other cities, Ephesus, Sardis. They rose not just against tax burdens or governors, but against the slow erosion of self. Athens, perhaps rashly, sent support. A small fleet. A gesture more symbolic than strategic, but symbolism matters in empire. Darius I, King of Kings, did not see ships. He saw defiance. He ordered maps redrawn and vengeance prepared. Thus began the first Persian invasion of Greece. It was not an overwhelming force, but it was well-trained, well-funded, and driven by imperial resolve. Yet at Marathon in 490 BCE, the Greeks held. Persian troops, weighed down by unfamiliar terrain and tactics, fell back. It was not a decisive loss, but it was not the victory Darius desired. 10 years passed. Xerxes, son of Darius, raised a second invasion. It was a campaign not just a war, but of pageantry. Bridges of boats across the Hellespont, provisions transported by sea and land, heralds sent ahead to demand earth and water, symbols of submission. This time, the Persians met a more organized resistance. At Thermopylae, Spartan warriors, vastly outnumbered, held a mountain pass. Their stand, though ultimately overrun, became myth. At Salamis, Greek naval tactics, honed in narrow waters, outmatched Persia's larger fleet. Persia lost again, not because it lacked strength, but because strength alone does not always win. Still, Persia endured. It was not broken. Its armies returned home. Its cities thrived. But the conflict left a scar, an imperial memory of defeat. And that memory mattered. Back in Persia, the wars exposed logistical strain. The empire, vast as it was, had cracks. Supply lines too long. Governors too ambitious. Satraps who had once deferred to the throne began to make quiet calculations. The Greeks had shown the world that the King of Kings could be resisted. Meanwhile, the Greeks wove the wars into legend. Persia became a foil in their storytelling, excessive, decadent, despotic. The truth was Messier, but myth travels faster than fact. In some ways, the Greco-Persian Wars changed little. No cities permanently changed hands. No regime was overthrown. But in perception, in image, they changed everything. Persia, which had once seemed invincible, now seemed vulnerable. The illusion cracked. And yet, to reduce Persia to its defeats is to miss the broader arc. The empire adapted. It fortified its borders, reevaluated its governors, and carried on. But something had shifted, not in power, but in confidence. As we close this chapter, listen for what remains unsaid. The mothers who never learned where their sons died. The satraps who began to dream of autonomy. The scribes who erased failed campaigns from records, leaving only golden victories. The Greco-Persian conflict was not just about terrain. It was about how empires perceive themselves, and what happens when that perception is challenged. It was about language, myth, and pride. And in that fragile intersection of glory and grievance, Persia would carry its wounds, draped in silk, hidden under gold, but never quite forgotten. Now, we turn to a more personal unraveling. To the men who inherited thrones weighted with legacy. To the gradual slide not from conquest, but from vision. The legacy of Persia began not with gold nor conquest, but with something older, quieter, and more difficult to maintain: vision. Cyrus the Great, founder of the Achaemenid Empire. Imagine a world ordered by justice as much as by power. His rise was not merely a political achievement. It was a philosophical departure. He spoke, or was spoken for, as one who sought not only to rule but to uplift. When Cyrus entered Babylon in 539 BCE, he did not sack the city. Instead, he claimed to liberate it. His inscription on the Cyrus cylinder paints a picture of a just ruler who respected local gods, restored shrines, and permitted exiled peoples like the Jews to return to their homelands. Whether one takes this as sincere belief or political theater, the effect was clear. Cyrus cultivated an image of benevolence. His empire, at least at the outset, was a place of relatively open faith, legal continuity, and administrative mercy. But vision, like flame, dims if not carefully guarded. Cyrus's death on campaign left a void quickly filled, but never quite refilled in kind. His son, Cambyses II, expanded the empire into Egypt. He too was powerful, but not adored. Ancient sources describe his reign as erratic, marked by brutal suppressions, sacrilegious actions, and a collapse in decorum. He reportedly killed his brother and mistreated Egyptian religion. It's hard to say what is truth and what is smear campaign, but the golden thread of Cyrus's idealism had begun to fray. Then came Darius I, not a direct heir, but a distant relative who seized the throne after a disputed succession. To legitimize his rule, Darius tied himself to Cyrus's legacy and then poured his energy into restructuring the empire. He introduced satrapies, 20 administrative districts governed by royal appointees. He introduced a uniform currency, built roads, and oversaw a network of scribes and spies that made Persia hum with order. It worked for a time, but the cost of this efficient governance was distance. Darius was no longer a king of the people. He was a sovereign of scribes. His rule was tidy but impersonal. The empire had become a mechanism, a machine that churned with gears of bureaucracy and the ink of distant decree. The king no longer needed to know his people. He needed only to receive their taxes and ensure their compliance. The construction of Persepolis, Darius's great ceremonial capital, was a marvel. Stone terraces, reliefs of tribute bearers from across the empire, grand halls of polished stone and golden adornment. But it was not a city meant to be lived in. It was meant to be seen. Power had become performance. The rituals grew thicker. Entry into the royal audience required precise gestures. Language became ornate. Clothing became symbolic. And yet, in this opulence, something was lost. Governance became ritual. Rule became repetition. Darius, in his later years, grew preoccupied with the Greek world, not because it was large or threatening, but because it was defiant. The Ionian Revolt of 499 BCE had been a sting to Persian pride. The Greeks had dared challenge the order of things. Athens, a city of merchants and thinkers, had helped fan the flames of rebellion. Darius's campaign against Greece, culminating in the Battle of Marathon, was intended not only to punish Athens, but to remind the world that Persia could not be questioned. And yet, the Persians lost. A small force of hoplites repelled what should have been an overwhelming tide. Darius's pride was bruised. Plans for further conquest were laid, but he died before they could be realized. Xerxes, his son, inherited the throne and the burden. Where Darius had fought out policy, Xerxes fought out of expectation. His campaign into Greece was massive, and it carried the weight of imperial pageantry. Pontoon bridges across the Hellespont, fleets fed by supply chains that stretched to Asia. At Thermopylae, at Salamis, he faced defeats more mythologized and perhaps militarily critical, but symbolic all the same. The empire still stood, but it had stumbled, and stumbling became habit. The successors of Xerxes faced growing difficulties. Rebellions in Egypt, unrest in Bactria, economic pressures. The satraps, once loyal governors, began acting like semi-independent kings. Tribute still flowed to the heart of the empire, but with more resistance. Some regions paid less, some withheld altogether, and still, in Persepolis, banquets were held. The image of the king, bejeweled, divine, unflinching, remained, but it no longer reflected the reality. Vision gave way to inertia. The court, too, became a maze of whispers. Eunuchs and nobles vied for access, influence, and appointments. Succession was less a matter of order and more a matter of survival. Some kings were murdered. Others ruled only in name. Plots thickened as provinces drifted. Cyrus's dream, a united, just, expansive empire, became diluted into fragments. Policies were no longer guided by reform or benevolence, but by the need to maintain order. The tax collectors arrived earlier. The punishments grew harsher. The distances between court and countryside became not just geographic, but moral. By the time of Artaxerxes II and III, the empire was a quilt of tensions. Greek mercenaries were hired to fight Persian wars. Internal conflicts drained resources. Rivals at court siphoned strength. The empire had not yet fallen, but it had forgotten how to rise. And yet, to the outside world, it still shone. The gold, the roads, the ceremonies, they remained. Traders from India, Arabia, and Central Asia still traveled its roads. Its cities still stood, but the soul had cooled. In the shadow of these declining years, Alexander of Macedon emerged. Young, ambitious, and raised on tales of Greek valor and Persian decadence. He invaded in 334 BCE. The Persian armies, still large, met him, but they lacked unity. The satraps resented the central authority. The court was bloated, distracted, reactive. At Gaugamela in 331 BC, Persia lost more than a battle. It lost its center. Darius III fled. The generals turned on each other. Persepolis was taken and burned, but the flame had gone out long before. The story of Persia's decline is not one of collapse, but of forgetting. It forgot its founding vision. It forgot the balance between rule and care, between ritual and purpose. It remembered how to collect taxes, but forgot why they were collected. It remembered how to punish, but forgot how to guide. And when a kingdom forgets why it exists, it dies, first in memory, then in stone. So now, as we listen to the silence of Persepolis and trace the faded lines on a crumbling map, we don't ask how Persia fell. We ask when it ceased to believe in its own beginning. And somewhere in that question, between the dream of Cyrus and fire of Alexander, lies the echo of an empire, beautiful, broken, and quietly gone. Chapter 5, Echoes of Splendor, What Remained After Fall. The fall of an empire often leaves behind rubble, silence, and memory. But in the case of Persia, particularly Persepolis, the echoes did not fade into quiet ruin. They lingered, embedded in fractured stone, curled within fading carvings, and stirred by the dry wind sweeping across the wide, terraced platform where kings once walked. Alexander's fire took its color, but not its soul. Persepolis was never meant to bustle like a city. It was the ceremonial heart of an empire, designed not for daily commerce, but for rare and radiant displays of imperial identity. Darius the Great envisioned it. Xerxes extended it, and artisans from across the empire, Medes, Babylonians, Egyptians, and more, helped build it. The walls were deliberate, the columns communicative. This was not a place to live, but a place to be seen, to awe, to endure. The stairways of Persepolis remain one of its most iconic features, broad, shallow, built to slow the pace of dignitaries, so that every step could be measured, every gesture choreographed. Each delegation etched into its walls, bringing gifts, animals, cloth, pottery, was frozen in time, a message carved in stone that the world had come here to kneel. Lions sunk teeth into bulls in sculpted panels, symbolizing eternal renewal. Trees bloomed from polished surfaces. Stars were chiseled where no light could touch. And at the center sat the king, still distant, divine, but eternity, as always, proved mortal. In 330 BCE, when Alexander the Great arrived in Persia, Persepolis stood proud but vulnerable. The empire, wounded and weary, could not protect its glittering heart. Accounts suggest Alexander may have admired the site at first, even contemplated preserving it. But soon, fire licked the beams. The exact reasons are still debated. Vengeance for the burning of Athens, drunken impulse, or calculated symbolism. But what is certain is that Persepolis burned. It was not the first palace to burn, nor the last, but it may be one of the only ones that refused to vanish. Even in ruin, Persepolis retained its grandeur. The great columns of the Apadana rose like broken teeth into the sky. Winged bulls with human heads still guarded shattered gates. Even the destruction seemed selective, as if the site itself grieved, yet refused to surrender its dignity. And so the centuries passed, but Persepolis never disappeared. Local communities gave it a new name, Takhti Jamshid, Throne of Jamshid, linking it to the mythical king from Persian legend, a ruler of boundless wisdom and glory. In this renaming, Persepolis was reborn not as an imperial relic, but as part of Iran's spiritual fabric. Travelers returned. So did poets, mystics, and thinkers. What Alexander tried to extinguish remained, flickering in folklore, in the way Persians spoke of the land, the ruins, the ancestors. Some even believed the site was touched by Solomon or other prophets. The ruins lived in imagination long before they lived again in scholarship. In the 20th century, excavations of Persepolis revealed thousands of clay tablets buried beneath the rubble. They were not chronicles of kings or speeches of conquest, but ration records, work logs, names of ordinary laborers and craftsmen, payments made in wine or grain, women listed as supervisors, children marked for light duties. What emerged was not just a silhouette of an empire, but its nervous system, its pulse. This Persepolis was layered and human. It was more than stone lions and silent halls. It was administration, sustenance, bureaucracy, the very opposite of glamour. Yet this too endured. European travelers in the Renaissance onward recorded sketches and travelogues. Some misidentified the site, imagining it the capital of Assyria or the lost court of the Medes. Yet they're always genuine. Artists painted it in twilight. Philosophers wrote of it as metaphor, and Orientalists mythologized it, sometimes to distortion, but never to indifference. What is remarkable is that Persepolis was never reoccupied or paved over. Later Persian dynasties, Parthians, Sassanids, even the Islamic caliphates, built elsewhere, leaving the site to sleep. Its sanctity, born of grandeur and fire, was too strong. It was respected, avoided, almost revered. In this strange exclusion, Persepolis was protected. Even today, the ruins of Persepolis still seem to rise above time. The columns, weathered and chipped, speak in a language of shadows and light. The way the sun slides across the eastern stairway in early morning, revealing old carvings as if awakening their memory. This, too, is ceremony. Every stone has its own echo, its own patience. Tourists today may tread its platforms and marvel at its vastness, but the power of the place goes deeper than tourism. School children study its blueprints. Poets use it as metaphor. Politicians invoke its image during speeches. Revolutionaries sometimes call upon it with reverence, and sometimes with caution. For while Persepolis embodies Persian greatness, it also whispers warnings about pride, impermanence, and the weight of legacy. In quiet moments, archaeologists still brush sand away from broken tiles. Each discovery is not just a remnant, but a resurrection, a proof that memory, buried long enough, can bloom again. From the clay tablets cataloging barley rations to the heavy stone lintels that once supported gilded roofs, Persepolis reminds us that nothing is truly lost if it has shaped the soul of a people. And in shaping Persian identity, Persepolis became more than a place. It became a symbol. Its fire did not end it. Its abandonment did not silence it. Time itself did not erode its meaning. Instead, it grew stronger through its survival. Today, when the sun sets behind Mount Rumith, the long shadow of Persepolis stretches out like a memory. It does not call for glory or conquest. It simply endures. In the face of time, empires, and men, it endures. Because ruins do not only signify what was destroyed. Sometimes, they remind us what could not be erased. Even after the last torch was snuffed out and the king's thrones were swallowed by time, Persia's cultural legacy continued to ripple outward, quiet but persistent. It left no singular monument like Persepolis, but its marks are scattered everywhere. In the curves of an arch, the twist of a motif, the whisper of a word, the shape of a garden. Persia's spirit lingered not only in stone, but in the everyday and the divine, in the rituals of courts, the songs of poets, and the ambitions of empires that followed. Art in ancient Persia was more than ornament. It was language, diplomacy, and theology. The Achaemenids, in particular, saw their empire as a canvas. They blended artistic traditions from across their lands. Mesopotamian winged beasts, Egyptian lotuses, Elamite attire, and Greek compositional balance. This fusion was not chaotic but curated, creating a visual identity that was both universal and distinctly Persian. Art was used to project authority and to symbolize the harmonious coexistence of many cultures under one ruler. Reliefs from Persepolis showed delegates from across the empire bearing gifts, a scene both political and aesthetic. One of the most enduring motifs was the wing symbol often called the Faravahar, a stylized figure with outstretched wings, seated inside a circle. Though its precise origins remain debated, it became one of the clearest visual representations of Zoroastrian philosophy. The soul's flight, the eternal struggle between light and dark, the moral balance required of every human life. You can still find its likeness etched into stone or woven into silver jewelry today. It has transcended religion and time, becoming an emblem of Persian identity. In architecture, Persia gave the world more than opulence. It offered elegance. The great hypostyle halls of Persepolis, with their forests of slender, fluted columns topped by animal-headed capitals, were marvels of symmetry and grandeur. These forms did not vanish with the Achaemenids. Later civilizations, Greek, Roman, Byzantine, and Islamic, borrowed their vocabulary, adapting it to new visions. In time, column porches, ceremonial stairways, and carved friezes would appear in places far beyond Persia's original borders, speaking quietly of their origin. The structural concepts that emerged from Persia helped shape classical architecture for centuries. Persian gardens deserve their own legacy. Known as paradisa, a walled enclosure, they were designed to mirror the cosmic order. For quadrants divided by water channels, representing the Zoroastrian elements of earth, water, fire, and air. These gardens were not merely aesthetic. They were theological, philosophical, and political. They promised harmony in an empire too vast to see all at once. Later, the idea of paradise, adapted through Islamic and Christian imaginations, would carry echoes of these Persian gardens, an afterlife conceived in symmetry, shade, and serenity. The word paradise itself is a linguistic heir to these gardens. Persian craftsmanship extended to textiles, ceramics, and metalwork. In the folds of silk dyed with crushed insects and rare plants, in the shimmer of lapis-inlaid goblets, and the careful hammering of gold into ceremonial masks, one finds the fingerprints of ancient artisans who understood luxury as devotion. Their goods traveled on trade routes, prized in marketplaces from Athens to Samarkand. Persian fabrics wrapped Roman nobles. Their glassware glimmered in Indian temples. Persian ideas, wrapped in beauty, spread without violence. From motifs on their carpets to the etching of inscriptions on their blades, there was a unified language of refinement. Language, too, was legacy. Old Persian, inscribed in cuneiform on cliff faces and palaces, may seem long forgotten, but its echo lingers in modern Farsi and in administrative languages that followed. Even during the Achaemenid reign, Aramaic was adopted as an imperial lingua franca, an early acknowledgement of diversity. Communication, like empire, required flexibility. The Persians understood that governance across a wide territory demanded shared symbols and common terms. What's more, Persian influence touched governance itself. The Achaemenids pioneered a system of satraps, provincial governors with local autonomy under imperial oversight. This model will be echoed in Roman provinces, Ottoman beyliks, and even modern federal systems. Their administrative genius was not only military, it was structural, legal, and quietly revolutionary. Their approach to bureaucracy became a foundational structure for managing pluralistic societies. In literature, while few Achaemenid texts survive, the memory of Persia thrived in storytelling. Much later, poets like Ferdowsi, Sadi, and Hafez would romanticize pre-Islamic Persia as a land of wisdom and nobility, turning history into epic. The Shahnameh, written centuries later, preserved a version of Persian grandeur that merged fact and myth. Kings and heroes became symbols, and even if the Achaemenids were not remembered accurately, they were remembered deeply. Their names lingered in verse, and their ideals were reimagined as the stuff of legend. The Islamic Golden Age would inherit and amplify Persian thought. Philosophers like Avicenna blended Zoroastrian, Greek, and Islamic wisdom. Astronomers in Shiraz gazed at the stars once charted by Chaldeans. Miniaturists painted gardens that resembled the old enclosures of Cyrus. Persian became a language of art, science, and devotion across much of the Muslim world. The fusion of Persian aesthetics and Islamic devotion created enduring works that remain admired centuries later. Persian culture left its imprint on religion as well. Though Zoroastrianism declined after the Islamic conquest, many of its rituals, ethics, and metaphors lived on, transformed, adapted, or hidden in plain sight. The reverence for light, the rituals of cleanliness, the emphasis on moral dualism, all these wove themselves into later beliefs. Zoroastrian ideas became threads in the spiritual fabrics of both East and West. Architecture, calligraphy, tapestry, tilework, each became a vessel for remembrance. And in every curved archway or rhythmic poem, something of the old empire whispered. Islamic calligraphy often danced through domes and walls in Persia, echoing the grandeur of earlier carved inscriptions. The turquoise domes, the intricate makarnas, the floral arabesques, all these bore the DNA of Achaemenid precision and elegance. Even today, Persian aesthetics influence everything from rug design to royal gardens. Modern Iran, for all its upheavals, continues to revere the sophistication of its ancient past. Tourists photograph the ruins, scholars publish tomes, and artisans still press ink into intricate tiles using centuries-old techniques. The symbols, designs, and philosophies of old Persia continue to shape national identity and artistic expression. So what does it mean to say a culture endures? Not that it remains unchanged, but that it continues to shape, quietly, insistently. Persia's greatness was never in conquest alone. It was in the ability to harmonize diversity, to elevate beauty into governance, and to cast its shadow through millennia. In quiet resilience, it survived fires, invasions, and decay, transmuted into gardens, tales, stonework, and syllables. Art, architecture, language, none of them shouted, but all of them remain. And in that, Persia never truly fell. Even after the fall of its great empires and the silencing of its kings, Persia lived on, not in political control or territorial dominance, but in memory, myth, and metaphor. Where stone crumbled and banners fell, imagination stepped in, breathing life into ruins and forging a second, softer empire, one of story, symbol, and identity. Persia became a place as much of the mind as of the map. Travelers from the West, long after Alexander's campaigns, wrote of its splendor in tones half real, half reverent. Medieval chroniclers spoke of the land of roses and nightingales, of noble kings and ethereal queens, where gardens blossomed under sapphire skies and wisdom passed from whisper to whisper. They did not see the mud walls or the burned scrolls. They saw what lingered behind them, a civilization that shimmered, however faintly, through the veils of time. It was this dream of Persia that found its most enduring form in literature. The tales of 1001 Nights, though rooted more firmly in Arabic and Indian sources, absorbed Persian motifs like soil, soaking rain, courtly intrigue, magical cities, silent sorcerers, glittering banquets. All felt Persian, even when they were not. Scheherazade herself became a kind of guardian of Persian memory, telling stories not just to survive the night, but to preserve something older than any caliphate, the Persian idea of wonder. This mythologized Persia spread across borders. European poets and painters, disconnected from the original empires, nevertheless invoked its name when conjuring luxury, beauty, and mystery. To speak of Persia was to conjure images of silken drapes, incense smoke, and quiet philosophical depth. Whether or not they understood it, they helped cement it. Persia became a metaphor for something timeless and rich, perhaps even unattainably so. But this myth-making was not always kind. Sometimes, Persia was remembered too beautifully, stripped of struggle, scrubbed clean of its contradictions. It became a land of lazy decadence and Orientalist caricatures, a place of static beauty that did not evolve or resist. The West, enthralled by its own imagination, forgot the resilience and resistance that also lived in Persian hearts. They remembered the perfume, but forgot the fire. And yet, the people of Persia, by now Persians in name, Iranians in nation, held their own memory close. Through waves of conquest, cultural suppression, and reinvention, they continued to evoke their ancient past. The ruins of Persepolis were never just stone. They were sacred. They were grief and pride, a wound and a crown. Poets did the remembering. Ferdowsi, with his monumental Shahnameh, gave voice to ancient kings long vanished. Rustam and Sohrab, Zahak and Jamshid. These names took on mythic weight, not because they ruled, but because they represented values, trials, and choices that transcended the moment. History blurred with legend, but memory remained sharp. In schools and homes, verses from Hafez and Sadi whisper of a Persia that was both real and unreachable. Children memorized couplets that spoke of gardens and stars, lovers and laments. These verses didn't mention Darius or Xerxes, but their cadence held the echo of Achaemenid harmony. Throughout Islamic Persia and later on, rulers tried to reclaim some of that ancient prestige. Safavid monarchs styled themselves as heirs not just to Islam, but to Cyrus. They built mosques that mirrored old fire temples in symmetry and sanctity. In their gardens, the fourfold division of Paradisa returned, now shaded by new theology. The past, reinterpreted, still guided the hand that planted trees. Even today, in modern Iran, you can feel the pulse of this memory. University students study Old Persian. National holidays invoke ancient heroes. Pilgrims and tourists walk the carved stairways of Persepolis not just with curiosity, but with reverence. This is not nostalgia, it is continuity. A living myth that remains rooted in the soil. In the diaspora, too, Persia has become an anchor. Iranian communities abroad often invoke their heritage through art, poetry, and festival. Nowruz, the Persian New Year, remains a bridge across centuries and continents. With every hyacinth placed on a half-seen table, with every verse of Hafez recited to mark a new beginning, Persia breathes again. So what is this myth of Persia, really? A mosaic, one made not just of gold and stone, but of memory, resilience, adaptation, and dream. It is imperfect and evolving. Sometimes it leans too far into romance. Sometimes it forgets its own darkness. But it lives, and in that it triumphs. In the quiet hours of night, as someone cracks open a book of poetry or runs their hand along the carvings of an ancient wall, the myth awakens, not loudly, not in conquest, but gently, in the way only old things know. Persia, the land and the legend, still whispers, and we still listen. In today's Iran, the echoes of ancient Persia do not merely linger in dusty textbooks or buried ruins. They live daily in the contrast between heritage and hardship, in a nation walking the knife's edge between reverence and reinvention. Here is a country where young poets quote Hafez under surveillance cameras, and engineers walk to mosques built on Zoroastrian foundations, a place suspended between a storied past and an uncertain future. This is not a new tension. Persia has always carried within it the seeds of prophecy, visions of a better order, of justice, of divine truth. Zoroaster, after all, was not just a priest but a prophet. His ideas of light triumphing over darkness were never meant to sit still in fire temples. They were blueprints for living, yet the fire did not always burn clean. Over time, those prophecies fractured into factions, and the clarity of the old wisdom gave way to the clamor of many truths. Persia's modern terrain is layered like a palimpsest. Beneath each city lies another. Susa beneath Shush, Ecbatana beneath Hamadan, Persepolis beneath the aspirations of Tehran. Every generation has written over the last, and yet nothing has fully erased what came before. Modern Iran continues to wrestle with its own story. The revolution of 1979 was a rejection of one vision and the installation of another. It reached back toward early Islamic ideals while simultaneously asserting a modern state identity. But threaded through its iconography and rhetoric were Persian motifs, heroic resistance, sacred law, and righteous kingship. The past is never just remembered here. It is reused, repainted, sometimes even rewritten. And so, you find this paradox. A country where religious law governs satellite dishes, where women veil themselves in mosques built on pre-Islamic stone, where ancient myths inform modern ideologies. Cyrus the Great, once buried in peace at Pasargadae, now appears in political speeches and classroom debates. He is invoked by monarchists and Republicans alike, by those who yearn for secularism and those who speak for tradition. One figure, many meanings. In the countryside, farmers still irrigate fields with ancient cannons. systems unchanged in the Achaemenid days. And in the cities, students code software while reciting classical poetry. The rift between past and present is real, but so is the bridge. Tradition is not just held, it is stretched and shaped. This duality extends to the social fabric. Urban elites sip coffee in rooftop cafes that would not look out of place in Paris, while rural communities attend ceremonies shaped by millennia of tribal and religious convergence. One country, many clocks. In some corners, the 21st century hums. In others, time barely stirs. Even the language carries layers. Persian or Farsi is rich with words that predate Islam, predate Alexander, predate even writing itself. It has absorbed Arabic, Turkish, Mongol, and French, each a historical fingerprint. And yet, when a Persian poet writes of love or exile or longing, there is something unmistakably old in the rhythm, something of the garden of the flame. It is this interplay, this tension between legacy and life, that defines Iran today. Not backward-looking nostalgia, but a struggle to live forward without severing what came before. The ancient road still runs beneath the asphalt. And so, when the world watches Iran through headlines, through satellite feeds, through whispers across borders, it often sees contradiction. But perhaps that is only because we have forgotten how to see complexity. Persia has never been simple. It was an empire of tolerance and tyranny, of wealth and want, of poetry and punishment. And so it remains. A land split between past and prophecy is not a land broken. It is a land still becoming, still listening to its old voices while forging new songs, still bearing the burden of its myth, while building futures that no longer fit the tales. Even in exile, Persian identity follows its children. From the tea houses of Los Angeles to the libraries of Paris, the diaspora continues to read Sadi and Rumi, to celebrate Nowruz, to wear gold bracelets etched with lines of ancient verse. These aren't mere customs. They are anchors in a world that no longer resembles the map their ancestors drew. Digital Iran, too, holds contradictions. Activists use encrypted messaging apps to share protest poetry and forbidden documentaries. Yet on the same networks, state media post religious sermons wrapped in imperial nostalgia. It's a feedback loop of longing and control, resistance and inheritance. Archaeological digs still uncover relics of forgotten dynasties, but more often, the deepest layers of Persian identity are found in the quiet choices. The father who teaches his daughter to read Hafez before she learns the Quran. The grandmother who bakes bread by hand while humming songs older than her nation. These acts, small and quiet, carry forward a lineage no regime can fully reshape. In a world rushing forward, Iran steps both ways, backward into memory, forward into complexity. It is the dual motion of a people who know that their story is too layered for single truths. To walk the streets of modern Iran is to hear the murmur of old kings and the shuffle of everyday feet. The ruins of Persepolis lie silent, yes, but their silence is loud. Their stones speak not just of what was, but of what might still be. As night falls on the story, as your eyes grow heavy, you might imagine it this way: a land dreaming through its own past, not trapped by it, but nourished by it. A nation that does not sleep, but dreams awake. A land not yet finished speaking. This is Persia, not the one from fairy tales, not the one drawn in borders, but the one that still breathes through prophecy and contradiction. And perhaps, like all ancient fires, it glows best when watched in the dark. Asterisk. Conclusion, where the dust settles, the dream remains. Persia is not gone. It has simply changed its name, worn new robes, spoken in new tongues. But the ancient rhythm is still there, beneath each layer of modern tension and digital noise. When we speak of Iran today, with its demonstrations and debates, its flickering hope and clenching fists, we are not witnessing a departure from history. We are seeing its latest chapter written in real time. Persia's greatness was never just in the stones of Persepolis or the gold of its kings. It lived and still lives in the endurance of culture, in the persistence of poetry, in the quiet breath of those who refuse to forget. Every nation must choose how to remember itself. Iran remembers not with nostalgia, but with contradiction, holding myth in one hand and a smartphone in the other. So let us end here, not with finality, but with silence. A kind of silence that holds memory like a jar of saffron, fragile, precious, lingering. And if you're listening in the dark, with eyes just beginning to close, know that you wandered through a place that never truly ended. Persia still dreams, and in dreaming, it teaches us how to live between what was and what might be. The Arabian Nights was not for everyone, but that Persia of dreams was. Time will caress all and flow to its end. Once again, if you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so we have more motivation to produce better quality products. And now, good night.